So for anyone that thought that Godzilla 2014 didn't feature enough of Godzilla himself story-wise, keep in mind that this is certainly not the first time this has happened. Hello people of the internet, this is Kaiju Noir with another Godzilla movie review. Today I'll be covering the fourth entry in the Heisei series, Godzilla vs. Mothra. Or Godzilla and Mothra, The Battle for Earth. Or Godzilla vs. Mothra, The Battle for Earth. Yeah, allow me to explain this. You see, back in 1964, when Mothra vs. Godzilla was released, the American distribution company, AIP, renamed the film Godzilla vs. The Thing, as a way of covering up the fact that Godzilla was going to be fighting a moth. Eventually the film would be retitled Godzilla vs. Mothra on home video, a complete reversal of the original title. Almost a decade later, Toho would make a film called Godzilla vs. Mothra, so TriStar changed the title of that film to Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth, most likely as a way of avoiding confusion between this and the retitled 1964 film. Though recently, I've noticed that the title Godzilla vs. Mothra: The Battle for Earth has been showing up on television, yet for whatever reason, the title Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth is still being used on Sony's latest releases, making it the official English title of the movie.
Everybody got that?
Personally, it feels weird to have the subtitle Battle for Earth, since it sticks out from the rest of the Heisei series and the Godzilla franchise as a whole, like a sore thumb. Well, with all of that complicated marketing backstory out of the way, let's dig in, shall we? The film starts off with a giant meteor hitting the Earth and causing a chain reaction of giant proportions, as the impact not only reawakened an ancient monster named Batra, but also causes a typhoon that unearths a giant egg. Oh yeah, and Godzilla woke up too. Cut to our protagonist Takuya as he raids an ancient tomb and escapes its numerous traps before being captured by the authorities at gunpoint. Hey, wait a minute! He's soon bailed out of jail by his ex-wife Masako on the agreement that he assists the company she works for in escorting her and her business associate Ando across the jungles of Infant Island in order to investigate a large mysterious object. Once they do so, they come across both a giant egg and twin fairies. These fairies call themselves the Cosmos and claim that the egg belongs to Mothra, a monster that will protect the Earth from the recently awakened Batra. After an exchange of words, the trio makes a deal with the Cosmos to allow Ando's company to transport the egg to a safer location where, unbeknownst to Takuya and Masako, it'll be used as a tourist attraction. The ride back home does not go smoothly, as Godzilla shows up to destroy this egg for no reason whatsoever, which then hatches to reveal a larval Mothra. She attempts to defend herself against Godzilla until Batra shows up to kill her, only to get caught in the middle of a fight with Godzilla that ends with both of them sinking beneath the Earth's molten crust at the bottom of the ocean. Afterwards, another conflict is brought up as the Cosmos are kidnapped and passed down from person to person, resulting in the Cosmos calling out for Mothra to rescue them. Tensions rise to even further degrees as Batra shows up stronger than ever in order to rid the world of Mothra so that it may wipe out humanity. Oh yeah, and Godzilla meets up with them as well. When watching this movie, you can clearly tell that this is more of a Mothra movie than it is Godzilla's, despite the misleading top billing. The film heavily borrows elements from both the original 1961 Mothra and 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla, where Mothra is treated as an antagonist as it attempts to obtain the twin fairies, and as a protagonist when it defends the city from both Batra and Godzilla. One of the biggest problems with this plot is that Godzilla feels almost irrelevant as he acts like the third wheel in a Mothra vs. Batra film. He essentially shares the exact same antagonistic role as Batra, where the plot redundantly sets up both monsters as destroyers of civilizations, while Mothra is supposed to act as the peacekeeper, an antithesis to their destructive tendencies. But whereas Godzilla is a metaphorical punisher of mankind, as I've discussed in my previous review, Batra is a literal bringer of death, created by the Earth itself to punish those who threaten its existence. However, unlike Batra, who has a history with Mothra, Godzilla doesn't have any real motivation to get involved in this struggle, and is simply there to throw a wrench into whatever plans the humans have in dealing with the moths. Now, if the filmmakers wanted to make a proper Godzilla vs. Mothra movie, Batra wouldn't even be needed, and could perhaps be alluded to as a legend of some sort that describes a monster created by Earth to be its violent protector, thereby giving the hint that Godzilla could be the reincarnation of that monster. From what I've gathered, the reason as to why the plot feels so disjointed is due to the fact that this film originated from previous scripts that ended up as failed attempts at a Mothra movie. Before Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth was made, both a Mothra vs. Bagon and a Godzilla vs. Gigamoth film were pitched in order for Toho to capitalize on another reboot of one of their popular characters. First, they had a script where Mothra would fight an ancient dragon named Bagon that awoken to destroy mankind for polluting the Earth. Then there was another script where Godzilla would fight against both Mothra and her mutated twin, Gigamoth. Eventually, the Gigamoth script would be reworked into Godzilla vs. Mothra by the writer of Godzilla vs. Bagon, who attempted to use Bagon's backstory for Gigamoth, now reworked into Batra. So what we have here is a mishmash of rejected scripts spliced together with ideas and concepts from previous Mothra movies. The pacing in this film also leaves a lot to be desired. While there is a need for a film to slow down and focus on character development, the film tends to take its time by the midway point, to where it feels like the second act battle we saw before didn't even matter. The film starts off well enough as it moves at a brisk pace and quickly introduces its protagonists and monsters. However, both Godzilla and Batra are conveniently written out of the movie so that the focus of the plot can switch over to Mothra and the cosmos. Then, both Godzilla and Batra are shoved back into the plot as abruptly as they were taken out, just in time for the climax. The characters, on the other hand, are fortunately much better executed. For instance, we have Takuya and Masako, a divorced couple with a 6-year-old daughter. I highly enjoy their antagonistic relationship as they're forced to work with each other while at the same time throwing snarky quips and insults at one another. As they spend more time together, it's clear to see that they still love each other, though deeply regret the decisions they made when they were younger. Having a divorced man as a main protagonist is incredibly unique for a Godzilla film, and is perhaps used by the filmmaker to commentate on how marriage was condoned in Japan at this time, where adults were possibly pressured into wedlock at a young age. If this is the case, this would be pretty ironic considering how the exact opposite problem is happening in Japan right now. Either way, Takuya is a very sympathetic protagonist who just wants to turn his life around, and his experience with the selfless acting people around him do more than enough to show him the right way to do so. Ando is another quirky character who is a businessman representing the construction company that's funding the expedition he, Takuya, and Masako go on. He's a likable character and initially acts as the yes man to a stereotypically greedy businessman who only cares about his company and nothing more. He does everything to please his boss, but he realizes just how insane he is when he cares more about his lost golf course than the people's lives during Godzilla's latest rampage. Speaking of which, his boss Tomokane is clearly another throwback to the villains of both Mothra and Mothra vs. Godzilla, as he attempts to use the cosmos for profit. However, his status as the human villain of the story is greatly diminished once the cosmos are quickly taken out of his hands. Worse yet is that he gets no comeuppance for his selfish actions, unless you count his minor breakdown right before the climax. Finally, there are the iconic twin fairies, previously referred to as the Shobijin, now renamed the Cosmos for this continuity. We get a little bit of backstory from them, as we learn that they are the last of an ancient race of beings that populated the Earth long before mankind came into existence. This was a race that was ultimately exterminated by Batra after they attempted to control the planet's weather. This society is never expanded upon beyond this description, nor is it explicitly stated exactly how these two were able to live for thousands of years watching over Mothra's egg. Though I'm perfectly okay with keeping a lot of their background in the dark, since a lot of the twins' appeal has always been their ambiguous backstory and relationship to Mothra. Although in this film, it appears that they have a clear connection to Mothra's power, as there are certain moments in the film where they would either chant or pray for Mothra, which seemingly gives Mothra the ability to perform certain tasks, be it transforming into its adult form or healing Batra. Speaking of their chants, it's great to hear them sing the classic Mothra song, as well as an all-new composition that, I would argue, is just as enjoyable to listen to. An aspect about them that I find fascinating is how they were willing to have Mothra go out of its way to rescue them, yet it was the words of an innocent girl that convinced them to stop Mothra's rampage. They were able to find hope in humanity as they watched her convince them that her father was a good man and would release them. Although what bothers me is how this pivotal moment is done smack dab in the middle of a monster attack, which seems kind of illogical. especially when you realize that Masako and Miki brought a small child to this disaster area. Oh yeah, speaking of Miki, she's in this film. She's used as a plot device, similar to her last appearance, where she's responsible for keeping track of Godzilla's location, and later to locate the cosmos after being kidnapped for the second time. Also returning from the previous film is Yuzo Tsuchiyashi, who I never brought up in the last review due to his minuscule role. For fans of Japanese tokusatsu shows, he's played by Akichi Kobayashi, who played Captain Muramatsu from Ultraman, Tobei Tachibana from Kamen Rider, and a ton of other shows. I figure I should bring him up here since his exposition-heavy role is shared with Akira Takarada, an actor who has starred in numerous Toho films dating all the way back to the original 1954 Godzilla. As minuscule of a role as the Environmental Planning Board Chief Gyoji Minamino is, there's one line of dialogue that always stuck with me, and that was when he described the meteor as a catalyst for a ticking time bomb that mankind created. While it is one of my favorite spoken lines in the Godzilla franchise, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in context to the film itself. Of course it ties into the environmental theme that's constantly present in the film, with Tomokane's corporation tearing down forests to build a golf course, the cosmos' punishment for building a weather-controlling machine, and Godzilla's awakening. However, the reason why the time bomb metaphor doesn't make sense here is because most of the damage that the meteor causes has no correlation with what humans have been doing on Earth outside of Godzilla's existence. They didn't create Batra, they didn't touch Mothra's egg on Infant Island, and they certainly weren't responsible for the massive weather anomalies. As for the kaijus themselves, along with the special effects used to portray them, they are fairly entertaining, but overall aren't as impressive nor as innovative as the material we've seen in the last two films. Godzilla himself is sporting an all-new suit that seems to be a more refined version of the '89 suit with darker skin and features more orange in his eyes. When comparing this suit to the 1991 suit, it appears that more girth was added to his body in order to avoid the problem of having noticeable folds and creases that the '91 suit had, which is definitely a plus in my book. What's disappointing about his portrayal is that his sound effects have been greatly altered, as he now has the roar from the classic series as opposed to the bear-like growl that he's had for the last 3 films. Also, the sound effects used for his atomic breath lost its static edge and is instead replaced by a high-pitched electronic sound, which is too reminiscent of the sound effects used for Mothra and Batra's beam attacks. One thing I have yet to mention about Godzilla in my previous reviews is his nuclear pulse attack, which has been used to great effect in all of his battles since Biollante. Rather than expelling atomic energy from his mouth, he instead swallows it and disperses it throughout his whole body like a defensive force field that pushes away his foes. I haven't mentioned it before because there was already a lot to cover when it came to the Big G, which is not the case here. As stated before, Godzilla serves no purpose in this story other than to fight the moths at the beginning and end. So as a result, we have no attempt at further fleshing out his character, his backstory, nor his lore. He's a plot device and nothing more. Hey, it's the 70s all over again. There is one scene of his that stands out though, and that's during his reappearance right before the climax, where after swimming through 1500 degrees of lava from the Philippine Trench all the way out in the Pacific Ocean, he arises from the top of Mount Fuji. The fact that he is powerful enough to not only survive such a feat, but to also reactivate a volcano that hasn't erupted since 1708 is incredibly badass, and truly makes him a literal force of nature, or rather a catalyst of nature, which further boggles the mind that Batra could even share such a role with Godzilla, when he couldn't do anything like that in this movie. While we're on the topic of Batra, I have to say, I do appreciate the idea of a dark Mothra that wishes to obtain the same goal as Mothra, but crosses that line between protector and executor. Design-wise, he's one of the few kaiju in the Heisei series that really feels like he came out of the 90s, with his black and edgy aesthetic that can only shout EXTREME! While the larval suit is very convincing, the puppet used for his adult form lacks any movement outside of the head and wings. An odd thing about Batra is how abrupt his transformation sequence is. Here we have Mothra spending a copious amount of screen time changing into her adult form, yet Batra just morphs into his adult form in the span of 5 seconds. I'd like to believe that this was done to show that Batra was more of a battle-ready creature, but the most likely case was that the filmmakers wanted to speed up the scene so that the film can get to its climax quicker. One last thing that bothers me about Batra is that his roar is straight up lifted from Rodan. Not only is this lazy on the filmmaker's part, but Rodan himself would be appearing in the very next movie. Well, maybe they expected the younger generation to not be familiar with the previous films and sound effects. Now we finally come to Mothra, the monster that this film dedicates so much of its time to. Much like King Ghidorah, her portrayal stays faithful to her previous incarnation, as she does not seek violence but prefers to live in peace, yet is ready to spring into action if the people she cares about are put in danger. Design-wise, her larval form is incredibly accurate to the one from the 60s, while her adult form is given a much more brighter and vibrant overhaul. Her colors stand out in a way that contrasts well with Batra and Godzilla, and overall match the more fantastical take on the character. The one issue that does bug me is that the material used to build the puppet looks like felt and feels the most artificial in comparison to her kaiju co-stars. In this film, she's given a huge boost in power, as she not only has an energy projectile attack from her antennae, but can also project lightning from her wings, and can heal her allies in the heat of battle. Along with this, her golden scales, which used to suffocate her opponents in previous films, now form a barrier around her opponent that can reflect any concentrated energy right back at it. What is she, a Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel monster? I'd like to think that the reason for why Mothra has so many powers in this film is to compensate for the fact that her puppet, along with Batra's, are incredibly stiff and can't be used all that much for close combat. Speaking of which, a lot of fans have often commented on how the Heisei series' fight choreography would often rely on sparks, glitter, and especially beam spamming. This has led fans to dub Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth, along with the following two films, as the Beam Wars trilogy. In fact, the physical choreography is so limited that the resolution to the climax ends exactly the same way as the last film, to a disappointing degree. With all said and done, Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth is a heavily flawed film, where the problems seen in King Ghidorah are reversed here. The human drama is quite strong and holds a lot of the film's entertainment value, yet the monster side of things feels like a poorly handled mess, with a repetitive role shared between two unrelated antagonists, while the lion's share of the film is dedicated to copying and pasting the plots to previous Mothra films. While I wouldn't recommend this film to any newcomer in the series, I would do so for seasoned veterans of the genre, as the film is still entertaining, just lacking in overall cohesion, which is why I'm giving this film a 3 out of 5. Despite its issues, this film turned out to be one of the most successful entries in the series at the time of its release in Japan. So once again, the Toho executives decided it was time to resurrect not one, but several of Godzilla's adversaries. Join me next time when I review Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Until next time everybody, take care.